we need to address one elephant in the room is, well, how accurate the device is. Well, big thing is FDA is, it's a medical device. So for medical diagnosis and, just to understand of what, does a person have diabetes, or do we need to just understand what's going on? So roughly 95 to 99% of the data has to be accurate. This is usually done in-house, in labs, and then it's also then gets carried out into outside the lab because it gets very intense. So it needs to be within 15% of all accurate readings or 20%. So it's going to depend on a lot of things. But the big thing is that right when you put on this monitor, there's several things you got to think about, even if you want to do this in research. Well, first is the first day of wear. Usually the first day of wear isn't going to be as good because, well, how long does it take to warm up the device? Plus, the device needs to get accustomed to the body. So there's that issue. Then there's the last day of wear. Well, I've been wearing this thing for so long. The adhesive's falling off. It's not going to be as good. But then you got to think so like I mentioned, it's measuring interstitial fluid. It's not like a glucometer. So you're going to find some discrepancy by maybe 5 points or lower, but you're going to see well, why? Well, interstitial fluid versus real blood. And then when you use these devices, some people can have an adherent issue. That might be an interference because of Tylenol or certain other medications. So it's always be mindful when you want to apply these devices is that we got to know who needs it and to avoid these issues. So what does this data look like? Well, as you can see, it's very continuously. So we could see from basically midnight all the way up till midnight. So you could see nice trends of what someone's doing from basically, so you could see is that, you'll see some trends, but the one thing you'll notice is right away is that look at around 3 o'clock. So you could start to see it's like, oh, wait a minute, this person might not be going above this threshold. Well, where is you see this 70 to 180 threshold. Well, what does that mean? This is called time in range or target in range. So pretty much there's a consensus you hear people say, I've got to get an A1C, I got to get an A1C. Well, beyond the A1C, people with diabetes are instructed that they got to stay this time in range. So specifically, if we look, is that, there's the high and then there's a low and then there's very low. Well, big thing is we got to say is that these are usually your targets we're instructed. So big thing is about 70% of your time needs to be about within this target range. But you do have some flexibility within above target and below, but you want to reduce as much time in both as much as possible. Now, people always think is like, well, how much is 1%? Because I want to change, or you're trying to improve, or you're trying to see behavioral modification. Well, just 1% is about 15% of the entire day, which is pretty impressive. And then it's also the best predictor of diabetic health long-term than an A1C. But just to give you an idea is, well, what do these devices on the market look like? So there's various types based on, their warm-up periods or their startup times, and then where is it worn. So there's many variabilities, and then you can see that they're also integrating with pumps, insulin pumps, and I'll get into that very soon. But the one trick is, like I mentioned earlier, is, well, how does someone cheat this? Look at those arrows. Those arrows are going to tell you a lot of information about what blood glucose is. So what are the arrows? These are trend arrows. So trend arrows are basically telling me is, well, where's my glucose going to hit? Is it stable? Is it trending lower? So I'm seeing decreases in my blood glucose, or I'm seeing increases. But then you might see some anxiety that starts to develop with some, patients, including myself, that let's just say you're at 180 and then all of a sudden you see my sugar's spiking over 90, climbing fast. So you get to see a lot of these different data that come to be is that, hey, if I'm going low, maybe I can eat a snack. If I'm going high, maybe I need to go for a walk. But again, how do you maybe cheat this system? Well, using these arrows, I was fortunate enough to run the New York City Marathon this past year, and here's my data. So I figured give a good example is that you could see that, you get to see these trends. So you get to see is, well, when do I need to get refueled? When I can avoid possibly hitting a wall? But there's one catch. Not every patient with diabetes is the same. So some people might say, I can't have this many carbs because it'll spike my sugar this much. Or I might need to not think about it. Or in my case, I don't run with my insulin pump. So this is actually manually controlling it off my hand. But then the biggest consideration is that what if we want to apply this into just a healthy population? Well, if I just told you your blood sugar is 135, do you know what the importance of that is? Do your parents know? Like, that's the big thing we got to consider, is that right now, this technology is still emerging. So trying to translate it in public implications is very difficult. But from the science side is that it could be really useful. So we can see is that, in MSSC, the most paper of the year that was published by Duran et al., is that we get to see a lot more information. So we could see is the glucose trends, the patterns, but then you can also link this with other devices. So maybe an accelerometer, but then with these devices as well, they cost a lot. Roughly about $300 for 3 of them, and that maybe lasts you a month. But then are people going to actually want to wear these devices? You got to put them in places that they might not like. But then the model's going to differ, so more people like Freestyle Libre because it's a more popular research device. But then the data access, well, how are you going to get this data? So there's a lot of considerations and implications. If you want to use these devices, think hard because there's a lot of things with the market. Now, going into insulin pumps. So insulin pumps, people with type 1 diabetes, they depend on these devices, instead of doing multi-daily injections, which is basically taking daily shots. So it's still an early involvement, and you could see it was, introduced in 1963. They could be tubed or tubeless. So tube or tubeless means is that, you could have this tube that's going to be wrapped around the pump just to administer insulin, or it's going to be like in a pod-based, which can be done. But then the type of insulin that you're using is short-term. So when I mean short-term insulin, is that meaning this is going to lower your blood sugar right away versus saying I'm taking a long-term shot, which is going to maintain insulin in my body for the entire period. Now, this is going to be beneficial because when it works with the CGM, it creates this hybrid closed-loop model. And just to give you a feel of what the model of these devices look like on the market, here's what they basically look like. They all come in different shapes and sizes and different placements. I happen to have the Tandem Mobi, which is basically the size of that. So it's relatively small. But, the thing is that, as you can tell with these devices, is that they're fading away from programming from the device. So they're actually becoming now programmable by a smartphone. So you can now tell, based off your smartphone, you can say, hey, I'm eating this amount of carbs, put this much of insulin in. Now, where does this artificial pancreas, or I always tell people, is what would happen if a CGM and a insulin pump hooked up? What happens? Well, this happens 24/7, 365. So this is going on even I'm giving this talk. So you have this sensor. So this is your continuous glucose monitor sensor. So this is transmitting your data, and it's going to be figuring out, okay, let's just say your sugar's 127. So your blood sugar's kind of stable because of this trend arrow. That then data is going to be sent to the pump. The insulin pump will then say, okay, what do we need to do about insulin therapy? Do we need to start in more insulin? Do we need to increase it, decrease it? What do we do? Well, because the blood glucose is stable, we're just going to maintain insulin delivery. Well, I had some orange juice before this, or, you might have ate something, and then you're like, well, wait a minute. We see an arrow that's starting to trend upward. The sensor's then going to integrate with the pump, and the pump's going to say, well, wait a minute, something's up. Start increasing insulin just a tad, because something's changing. Then you might have eaten lunch, kind of like what we're going to be doing relatively soon. So your blood sugar's high, let's just say 220, and trending upward. Well, you already kind of told the pump already, hey, I ate this much, it's going to still already maintaining insulin delivery. Well, if say in the next 30 minutes, your blood sugar is maybe now, let's just say 250 or still trending upward. This insulin pump is going to actually give you another bolus of insulin without you even telling it, which is beneficial because then it's reducing fatigue, so you don't have to worry about, hey, do I need to calculate how much more insulin do I need to do to drop me back down? So let's just say we're dropping now. We're at a glucose of 104, dropping down. Of course, you would probably expect that, we would want the pump to start decreasing. Well, there might be cases that would be like this. You go run, oh, your blood sugar is really trending downward. The insulin pump will completely stop delivery, and it will just resume once blood glucose gets back in range. But you might be already asking is, well, how does exercise interplay with this? Well, let's just say you have to enable an exercise mode. So you need to tell the pump, I am going to exercise. So this is going to do is this algorithm from the pump is going to tightly control how much time your blood sugar should stay in a specific range. So it's going to be within 80 to 160. And then it's going to decide, well, how much more insulin do we need to do? So it's, kind of beneficial of trying to avoid, a hypoglycemic state during exercise, because that would be very dangerous. And just to give you a feel of what is it like, the difference between multi-daily injections versus using an insulin pump. So just to give you a feel, this is actually this is when I was first diagnosed using a continuous glucose monitor. I was actually the person that trended upward at night. Usually most people trend downward. But I kept doing shots at night, and if we remember going back to the time and range, I'm roughly at 70%, which is borderline. 6 months later, I start getting an insulin pump. You could start to see the reductions in this pattern. So you get to see, this is the big thing that clinicians like to see is, how much progress has been made, especially, look at the time and range, how much it differs between each group. But there is something now emerging in the market, which is becoming a little bit of a interest and excitement, but it's also very dangerous. It's the non-invasive approach. So actually, it started back in 2001. Not too bad, this device was fairly decent, but then people were like, what's the accuracy? What is the beneficial of this? Why do we, it kind of got an uproar because it was too ahead of its time. Flash forward to today. I can go on Amazon, I can find this device for maybe $100, and they'll tell me what my blood sugar is. But how accurate it is? Well, that's where it's going to get very complicated because, how do you test these type of devices? So there's a lot of involvement, but, the FDA is starting to catch on to this attention of this trend, hey, what is going on? And then you have some companies, let's just say if you own an Apple Watch, there's actually stuff that's being in development right now with these CGMs and possibly doing it through non-invasively. But as of right now, it's advised not to worry about using these watches because they will probably underpredict or overpredict your reading. So a good example, I saw a YouTube video that said, well, at rest, you're fine. Okay, I'm going to eat something. This basically K-Watch underpredicted your blood glucose by 30 points. Well, that's dangerous for a type 1 diabetic patient. So still right now, you're on the side of caution of trying to use these devices, but if you really want some good takeaways is that, glucometers are really the gold standard. So when in doubt, if you need to really know what someone's blood sugar is, do a blood test. But then, if you're starting to see that, maybe I can get some data from a CGM, you can see different things, whether it's a pattern or exploring time and range. So you get to see a lot of information and maybe decide how to prescribe a good, healthy prescription that's optimal for someone. It's beneficial for both fitness and science, so it's best of both worlds. But again, how do we translate this into public view is that, like I said, your blood sugar is 140. Why does that matter? And then remembering the hybrid closed loop system. This thing is running 24/7, 365. The only time it'll stop is if you stop delivery and disconnect for a swim or something. So you always got to factor in that this thing is basically keeping someone alive and healthy. But the involvement in this area, it's still relatively new. Think about 10 years ago. When you first heard the Apple Watch and Fitbits were measuring heart rate, people were like, why do I need to monitor my heart rate? Now, everybody's monitoring their heart rate and know why it's important. So now it's, blood glucose still hasn't hit that mark yet, so it's going to take some time. But the biggest takeaway that I always tell people, especially with patients that have diabetes, is that if you're just measuring their blood sugar, you're just looking at the surface level. You're not seeing anything else in between. So you're constantly, as a patient with diabetes, you're constantly thinking, how many carbs was that meal? So if I'm eating a lunch, maybe at a restaurant, how am I supposed to calculate this? Oh, but wait, you want to go exercise right after. Insulin's on board, meaning you already put insulin in your body, so you got to be warned of like how much, what is your body going to do in the next long-term effect. So there's a lot of things. But then the biggest thing we definitely cannot forget is, we don't want someone to go in hypoglycemic, but, another case, especially with type 1 patients, is diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a very dangerous problem. But it's just a quick overview, just to give everyone a feel of it, but happy to discuss more during the panel discussion, so leave it with that.